fire scar that we give a GPS coordinate to. Often resinous pine snags will be preserved for 150 years or more. It's pretty amazing. So that we can, you know, as you'll see, get back into the 17 and 1600s or more. We cut a cross section out of these samples, take it back to the lab, and spend a lot of time on it. Many sampling and dating problems occur in the northern forests, especially along lakes. These include, do we have a good reference chronology to date the wood with? The changing lake levels, due to logging, due to beavers, and the rapid decay in some of these areas. And then there's winter camping fires. We really would not want to date winter camping fires. We're looking for larger scale ecological phenomenon. Nonetheless, there are many slow-growing trees with, up to 100, 300 scars, and snags on drier sites, a lot of eschers, and a lot of places near bogs that have excellent fire scar records with multiple scars. A lot of places have very high fire scars, which indicates that at some point, long vertical scars, indicate that there were intense ground fires in these areas at times. Not all trees are like this, but some are. Fire scars come in many forms, but all have, generally charcoal and cambial death. And a lot of them are on live trees, which we tend not to cut that much because they're old and we don't, I don't know. Dan Day has joined me here. He is involved greatly in this project, and he may speak to you if you hear another voice chime in on some management issues in these different places. One thing we do run into, like for instance here at this site, we use Dave Tovey, a Maine logger and guide out of Grand Lake Stream, Maine. And they have all kinds of interesting, local information about, maybe canoe routes from one side of the country to the other, or one side of the state to the other at least, from down east Maine to Quebec, and these are some things we can test about these things. If we know that this is a canoe route, and we know that climate, for instance, is causing some fires, do we see like the fire history from Jackman, Maine? Is it like anything near Grand Lake Stream, which is I don't know 100 kilometers away at least? If I take you down now to Pennsylvania, this is Dr. Musica standing next to a red pine in north central Pennsylvania with 8 fire scars. There's some old fire scars in the mountainous region of the Adirondacks in New York. So once we get our samples cut, brought back to the lab, sanded, so you can see the cellular detail of each ring, so we can date them. Although in this case, it was really easy to date it because we were at a logging deck, and that had just been logged in 2012, and so we started out with a pretty good idea of when the tree dated. So this was very easy. But this is an interesting site. This is north of Lake Millinocket, Maine, and there's a whole, I'd say, how many acres, Dan? Like several thousand acres with this same fire history there, with these, 1934, 1903, and somewhere around 1800. And these are all kind of periods of extreme drought throughout much of the eastern United States. Now this is kind of a cool cross-section because it has more fire scars than any other cross-section we found in Maine. And this is from Guyette Lake in Down East Maine. And you can see the numbers of scars in there and how it's affected growth and how the record goes. And this one goes back to 1590. This one I wanted to show you. This is actually from the Upper Peninsula of Maine, a place that's even snowier than the Northeast. They get about 13 feet a year on average. And but nonetheless, it melts off and fire occurs there at various times. And this is one of our oldest sections. We rarely get stuff into the 1440s, but we do get some. Here's some more cross sections from Maine. The top two sections had over 300 rings in them. Here's some more from Maine and Pennsylvania. You can see one in the upper left corner is one from Millinocket, Maine, with those same 3 scars that we saw before. Actually, this one has one in 1887, so it has an additional scar in it, in addition to the date of the 1800 date when the tree propagated after a fire or logging event. We don't really know. Could be probably both. But and then on the bottom left, we see a cross section with a lot of scars on it from right near a bog environment in kind of a grassy, sandy place in north of Lake Millinocket, with a lot of scars in the recent scars. Also, you see here in the upper right-hand corner from the Pennsylvania state game lands is I think this is a pitch pine with many scars. We don't really, although we see those in southern Pennsylvania, we don't see them in northern, and we don't see them actually that frequent of scarring anywhere north of Pennsylvania. At least we haven't yet. Here's a pitch pine from Pennsylvania with scar dates on it. Oh, and let's see, it must be, okay, so now we're going to take another kind of look at Maine from, or at least our fire sites, from some Google Earth maps. And, you know, this slide tells us 2 things. One is that we see that many of these environments are extremely varied in their moisture regime. They might be a bog, they might be next to a lake, they might be on top of an esker. So this really creates a lot of variability in fire in a very small area. Like this graph in the bottom right corner is what we call a fire history diagram. Each horizontal line is the life of a tree, and each vertical line is a scar. Each small vertical line is a scar. And then at the very bottom we have a composite of this data that tells us the dates of these particular fires. This is one of the most important diagrams you might see today. And it shows the frequency of fire intervals, or of their length class. In other words, if it's 20 years between fires, then we have, in this case, if we go to the y-axis, we got 16 of those in this one 1 kilometer. So we found 16 occurrences of fire in this 1 kilometer area near Guyette Lake. On the other hand, a lot of those trees had only a 100-year interval. You know, much longer fire intervals. These tended to be on peninsulas and right next to the lake. But remember, this is a small area, but it's extremely varied in its moisture and soil regimes and such. And so that there is, even in the smallest area, or not the smallest, but even in 1 kilometer, there's all kinds of, you know, difficulties in assessing, you know, what is the the fire regime here. You know, can I really assign it a number, just one average? You know, managers, I would say, need to look at this and think carefully, because some areas, you know, in this kilometer, they probably were burned a lot, whether it was because there was lightning on the top of a short esker, or whether it was because humans were burning in this area for some particular reason. Fires do seem to be more abundant, fire scars anyway, seem to be more abundant on the edges of these large and small bogs. Now here's a map of north of Millinocket Lake in mid-Maine, and you can see it's got these huge areas of grasslands. And I'd like to hear from anybody who's particularly has some particular knowledge about whether these, how often, or whether these large bog swamps, do they burn? Does it get dry enough for them to actually burn? It'd be good to know. I don't really know that. Here's another one near another fire history near Middle Joe Mary Lakes, which is maybe southwest of Baxter State Park, 30 miles away. And this one is composed of trees that exist along the lake, right along the lake. You know, it's not along bogs, it's around the lake. So these are kind of interesting, because we get a little bit, you know, we get, like, as you can see on this one, around 1800 and around 1900, we get actual fires that cover much of the region, whereas most of the fires are much smaller in size, as we think we could tell that from so few of them being scarred in the same year. And let's see here, we got to move it. Move to another venue here. Okay, there we go. So anyway, here's again a view, a Google Earth view of Lake Millinocket. And let's see, right in the middle of this, right along that road, we found one of our sites with the most fire scars on it, kind of a sandy, grassy area right adjacent to the bogs. This is one from Algonquin Park in Ontario. Did this a long time ago. It's got the 1780 fire scar, which is pretty interesting, because at the end of the program here, I'll throw up some citations, but there's a whole, especially in New England has a name for May 19th, 1780, and that's called the Dark Day. And that's when the legislature closed because they couldn't see what they were doing inside, because it turned into night because of atmospheric particulates from fire. Now here's one that's a long way from New England. This is in Alabama. It's a longleaf, mountain longleaf pine remnant from the Talladega National Forest. And as you can see, it has many more fire scars than we would expect to see on a tree in Maine, for instance, where burning seems to have much longer intervals. You know, I point that out because at the bottom, very bottom of this map, there's a couple red kind of flames out of Alabama, and these are from that site, that particular mountain longleaf site. But as you can see, if we, you know, I did this particular slide for this presentation because I wanted to show you how temperature seems to be a major player in fire regimes and in their frequency. So if we look at in Maine, we've got 3 or 4 sites there with data on them. And then as we go down through, I think Mann and Engstrom did a study in Vermont. And then we're doing a lot of studies in Pennsylvania. Henry Grusin and Mayer and LaFawn and others have been doing studies in Virginia. We did a study there in Kentucky and in Tennessee and then in Alabama. And as you can see on the left here, I've got just a temperature axis on the bottom, temperature in degrees Celsius, and the Appalachian mean fire intervals along the Appalachian Mountains. And as you can see, as temperature goes down, or temperature goes up, fire goes down, or the fire interval goes down. In other words, you get shorter and shorter fire intervals. And it's this is something we see in the Great Plains. We see it, in fact, we see it all over North America. It's not just peculiar to Appalachia or New England. So, many carbon-based exothermic reactions that occur in ecosystems, they have to have activation energy. So if you're a chemist and you're in the lab, you're on your bench top, or if you're a guy in an ecosystem, you can think about fire all day long, but unless you break that first carbon bond that makes the energy hot enough to break another carbon bond to come into this exothermic reaction that we often see in ecosystems,
really?
Nothing will happen. And that, in fact, in many ecosystems, many eastern ecosystems, it will be a very dry year. But if there's nobody around, like a human or lightning, to start that fire, it just doesn't happen. And so this is part of the physics and chemistry for the fire process in ecosystems that isn't accounted for by the equations I use. But just think about, how people, because we're kind of what I would call totally obligate fire critters. We need fire every day. We're not like some orchid that needs it once in a while every few years. We need it every day almost. And whether it's in our apartment, because of some natural gas or oil, or whether it's in my wood stove at home, we need it. And there's many fire histories that are attached to these populations of different human beings. The Passamaquoddy, near Grand Lake Stream in May, the Indian Territory is right there. The Leech Lake Band of the Ojibwe in Minnesota near Cass Lake, very special fire history there. And some of this is written up and some of it's not. But in Michigan, Maine, Minnesota, in many places we get a very strong human signal of one kind or another, that shows us that ignitions play a huge part in addition to any climate situation. So there's some, you can read through some of this, but I guess one of the things that I think of is chemistry, the chemistry of fire, just the basic chemistry of combustion is a basic thing in fire, whether it's in your car or whether it's in an ecosystem. You can't really get around it. I mean, it's the same reaction, and there are, in ecosystems, there are many, many other things that govern the frequency of fire, from, like I say, ignitions or vegetation or slope and aspect, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic and first kind of thing that's going on is that carbon bonds are being broken by heat. So that's why we go into the chemistry of these things. Some important equations that are involved in wildland fire that we don't always think about is one, photosynthesis. If you don't have enough fuel, or you have too much fuel or not enough, it really counts in how much fuel we have. Inorganic combustion, that's fire. How much of it do we have? Organic combustion, how much do the termites and the bacteria take away from, they're breaking down carbon bonds, eating it. Every carbon bond is somebody's breakfast if they get around to it. And then, so then this all kind of translates into a couple things. One is the reaction environment. What is that like? What's the temperature? You know, what's the humidity? All the things that many prescribed burners look at. And then the other thing is, you know, what's the concentration of reactants? This is called, you know, a rate equation for the driven by the concentration of reactants. More fuel, you tend to get a faster rate of reaction. Less fuel, you go out to the desert where there's you know, a bush every 20 feet. Well, the concentration of reactants is going way down. So it takes a different type of reaction environment to actually make that burn. At the bottom of this diagram, and I'll go over this in some more detail, is basically what we use for our rate metric. In ecology, that's the mean fire interval. And then how it is affected by, you know, just after the first plus sign there is what I call is modeled after the concept of the Arrhenius equation, which was created for a Nobel Prize 100 years ago. And then on the right of that equation is the reaction, the rate equation for concentration. So we'll go through this real quick. I know you're all here for a big chemistry lecture. But anyway, the first MFI, we call that the mean fire interval. It's a rate metric, and you can adjust it in different ways. 2, collision frequency, part of the Arrhenius equation. That is, you know, if we have 2 molecules and they hit in space, they actually have to hit at, you know, just the right angle and such in order to create the reaction. Also, the big deal here really for ecosystems is that humidity around these oxygen atoms and fuel atoms is a big deal because it inhibits the reaction from happening. Activation energy. Every reaction needs, you know, every exothermic reaction needs that spark, that ignition by a human, that ignition by lightning. The gas constant, I won't go on about that one. Temperature and K. Now, temperature is probably the biggest part of this equation in many ways. Now, it's also, I found out the hard way by working 3 or 4 months on this equation, that when I was using Fahrenheit and Celsius, this is a thermodynamic equation. It has to be measured in Kelvin. In other words, how, you know, what is heat? It's just how fast the molecules around us are moving around, and that's a thermodynamic thing, and we need to measure it in Kelvin, or this model just wouldn't work. Precipitation is a big thing in fire. Now, sometimes, you know, it's a 2 kind of edged sword. Precipitation is one, the more you have, the more fuel you have, which is important because that increases the concentration and the rates of fire. But also the more you have, the more inhibitor you have of collision frequency among molecules. So precipitation is important. And this whole second term that I use is really about the concentration, trying to estimate the concentration of fuels. So what can we do with, you know, if we go to equations, we can start to bring in data like MODIS data, PRISM data, all kinds of different climate data sets to estimate what the combustion rate is for, or probabilities are for different ecosystems. And you see this one equation does well in some of these areas, like as you can see the Sahara, you know, in the gray doesn't, you know, it burns greater than every 200 or actually 6 or 7,000 years or something. And the same with the top of Greenland. It doesn't burn either, but not because it's too hot, it's because it's too cold. It doesn't produce any fuel. Neither of those environments produce fuel. Another, we do this a little bit because it gives us some validation concentration, or excuse me, some validation in world climates of how the equation works. Here we have MODIS data, fire output, and then as you can see, it matches the northern part of Indonesia and Australia. We used 180 sites from around the United States to calibrate this, what we call the physical chemistry fire frequency model. And this is what it looks like across the United States. Again, here's a map of New England, or our area of interest. I've just pointed out with little arrows here several places. Down East Maine, for instance. So this is a complex moisture environment. And we see intervals from 20 to 100 years between fires. The model tells us that Mount Katahdin burns, from 150 to 200 years or more. That's what we predict anyway, based on combustion chemistry. Now, if the longest place in the eastern United States, the longest fire intervals in the eastern United States are in this region, on Mount Washington, which burns, much greater probably than 200 years. There are a couple spots in the forests of Vermont that burn this long. But then as we go down into the warmer areas of into the southern areas of the consortia, the North Atlantic Fire Consortia in northern Pennsylvania, we start getting down to 30-year intervals, and then as we get into southern Pennsylvania, we get into even much shorter intervals because So another thing.
Oh, Richard, pardon me for interrupting. It sounds like the background noise is getting kind of distracting. Would everyone on the phone please mute your line if you're able to? If not, I'm afraid, Richard, we might have to ask you to call back in with the moderator code so that we can not have the background noise.
Okay.
Do you have the moderator code still?
I typed. They wouldn't accept my code. That's why I got into this. So I don't know what I still have it, but it doesn't work or something.
This is unfortunate. The background noise is kind of distracting. I wonder if you could. I'm going to ask you to give it a try again. And in the meantime, I wonder.
You might want to tell me a different code because the one I got, I did it 3 times and it wouldn't let me in.
Okay.
Well, let's just talk. We're down to once. Let's just continue for a couple slides, and then we'll. These are 2 maps that we produced recently in a paper, 2014, that show future changes in the climate forest fire probabilities. And the one on the left is in particular interesting because that's a coupled general circulation model. And it's one of the more conservative global climate change models data that we use in predicting what might happen. In this case, I think it's 2090 or so. And as you can see, what I first saw when this model was that look at the Northeast. I mean, it's full of the red blobs that are like 60 to 80% increase in the probability of fire. In other words, climate alone, I'm not talking about new fire departments or prescribed fire or more people or less people, but climate is pushing fire in that direction quite profoundly in this really conservative model that models like most of the general global change models. the fluid dynamics model from NOAA is a little different, and in fact every global change estimate of precipitation and temperature is different, and that's good because every year they get better, we hope, but what the physical chemistry model does for us is we can take data, climate data from anywhere, and stick it into it, and it's going to tell us something about how the combustion regime of an ecosystem is going to improve or not improve in terms of fire. Anyway, and so I'm going to call it a day at that. I'm going to leave this slide up here. Much of what I talked about is in great deal in these papers. Not all of them, but not all of what I talked about, but much. Dan, do you have any comments? So I'll open it up to questions now, and I'll let's keep this up so you can kind of, if you want to copy down anything or. Okay.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay.
All right. So we had a couple questions come in the chat box during your presentation. Kevin Smith asked, in the AR term of the predictive MFI, can we accept that human activity in early societies will inevitably provide a spark, and then simplify the term to C in degrees K?
Okay. I'm going to have to think about that question. This model was made while humans, in periods when humans were in North America. And, we don't use humans as a predictor variable, or vegetation for that matter, in this particular model. But it is made in a place, North America, where there's been humans for 14,000 years. So we cannot take their ignitions and cultures out of this model. I don't know if I'm answering it totally. The AR term, let's see, how that's not really affected by humans because, well, there's no humans in there, but it does rely on activation energy, and
yes,
humans are good at that.
Yes, Kevin Smith clarified. He said, right, so the energy of activation can be assumed to be available.
Right, yeah. If there was no lightning or no ice lenses or no people, that would mean that we wouldn't have much fire in this continent. If you take away all the ignitions, my model wouldn't do anything. It really, we think about it as it's a random ignition. They're not random ignition sources, but in fact, we use the residuals of the model to tell us where, hey, look at this particular region, like say Gassabias Lake in Maine. It's way out of what we would predict just from, climate alone. Something else is going on, and it might be that the Passamaquoddy Indians were actually burning down there for berries or moose or something else. Okay.
All right. Angela Puma had a question also related to the region. She said, do you feel the equation could be simplified using precipitation and temperature relationships only and still be effective? There's
two parts to a fire process. One is you've got to have fuel. Like for instance, you might have the fanciest car in the world, but if there's no gas in the tank, it's not going anywhere. And that's the same with fuel. Fuel is important. The other part of it is the reaction environment. And maybe some of the Northeasterners have had trouble with this year. When temperatures get very cold, it's hard to get a fire started or to keep it going. It's the same as with your car. It's hard to get it started sometimes when it's 30 below zero. And things don't. So basically, what we're talking about is in the equation, you have to have reactants. Some estimate of reactants of what the concentration of fuel is like, and then you have to know about the environment. if it's 100 below zero, it's going to be hard to get anything going on because the rate of molecules has slowed down so greatly. It's hard for them to get hit each other with enough force to make a reaction. So you got to have the reaction environment that it's occurring, and you got to have the concentration of reactants. Those two are really kind of separate things, so that I doubt that you could ever kind of bring them together. In fact, I tried to bring them together a lot, and I failed. But then I realized, maybe they don't go together.
Yeah, well, thanks for answering that. Andrew Barton had a somewhat related question. He says, not sure how you could add this to your equation, but I would guess that a large part of the unexplained variance in your model is due to not including seasonality or precipitation. Any ideas how to add a seasonality term?
Well, we're thinking about adding a seasonality term already, but in a sense, when you look at these maps, they let's see. When you look at some of these maps like this one, we already know the seasonality that's going on. In the Rocky Mountains on top, hey, it's not burning. It's not burning there in the winter. If you go down to Florida or Alabama, well, spring, winter, fall, you might get some fires in there. Or you do, that's when the fire season is. And when you go up to northern Maine, that fire season is never in the winter. It's always some situation in the dormant season, from I don't know, you'd be better off telling me, but in a sense it's already in there. When you look at this map, it's a mix of seasonality. And that seasonality, could we produce it? Well, we use mean maximum temperature in the map. So whenever the maximum temperatures and the maximum fuel moisture collide, well, that's kind of when the fuels. That's when the fire season happens. So I don't know if I give you an answer to that or not, but we're actually looking at that in trying to reflect how the seasonality change or whatever might affect fisheries habitat. Wow,
that's great. Yeah, we had a couple more questions that are going in a slightly different direction. Neil Peterson's asking, was a 1780 fire reported by SCARS into the Northeast?
Reported by
SCARS.
Oh yeah, and
right.
Of course, if you really want to see the details, actually, that's interestingly, when science and culture collide, we get the best publications we ever have. And that's, if you look at the bottom of the text here, McMurray, Stambaugh, and 207, fire scars reveal the source of New England's dark day. It's an international journal of wildland fire, and it's quite, it's a different time. When people see when the sky gets dark in the middle of the day, people, religious people have trouble with that. Well, so does everybody else, I guess. But and that was interesting because that paper actually was derived from some of our Ontario work, and that anyway.
Yeah,
so that's.
Yeah, one of our another question. I think Bill Patterson had a response. He says, "Good point. From my experience with a variety of New England cover types, these." Oh, I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Okay, I'm going to jump back to another question, and we'll get to Andy Cutco's and then Bill's comment. Inga had a question. How do you use the fire scars to validate or calibrate your model? You're kind of tying these two together.
Right. I did not really, as I said, I just didn't. I could spend hours on the model, and I didn't. But I think it's worth presenting anyways. So yes, how do we calibrate? Actually, the way we calibrated this model was, we had first we had to imagine it. We had four gods: the statistic god, and the fire ecology god, and then we had the chemistry god, and then the physics god. And we had to. We had to look at all of those equations and laws in those different fields to start the model, and so that's how we began the calibration. Now, what we used was fire scar data from all over North America, Canada, and now we have stuff from Mexico and Australia. So wherever there's a metric, or by metric I mean some rate, some estimate of the rate, usually it's a mean fire interval from a study, we can use that in our right now we have 180 or 90 fire histories from people, which I would say of those folks, at least more than 60–70% are done by many, many other workers in fire history throughout the world, and especially in Western North America. And I probably only have 40 or 50 of those. But so we have these data from probably 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 trees, I don't know, something like that. And each one of these fire history sites has, maybe 100 fire scars. So in other words, in this model, it was calibrated with approximately 20,000 fire scars from all kinds of different climates, from the Brooks Range in Alaska to Australia. So I guess that's how we get, and because it is it's kind of a model that uses proxies, a lot of climate proxies. I mean, some of our fire history sites actually have measured temperature right at the site or measured precipitation, but most come from either some other kind of data about the site.
Great, thank you.
Climate data.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you again if someone could, if whoever's got some background noise, please try to mute your line. That would help us out. I'm going to go on to the next question from Andy Cutco. He says, interesting presentation. Your model suggests more frequent fire intervals than some of the literature suggests. In creating the maps, how have you factored in northern hardwood sites that typically have a much longer interval?
Right now, many of the would you like to answer this? Here, ask that question again.
So the question again from Andy Cutco was, your model suggests more frequent fire intervals than some of the literature suggests. In creating the maps, how have you factored in northern hardwood sites that typically have a much longer interval? And as an add-on, Bill Patterson says, good point. From my experience with a variety of New England cover types, these intervals seem at least a factor of 10 too short.
Too short meaning too frequent? I guess I would have to look at the literature that they're making reference to. Sometimes in the literature you'll find estimates of fire that are stand replacing fire, and what's being predicted by Rich is low intensity fires that don't necessarily express themselves in age structure of the forest or dates of origin that you might get from an age structure analysis. So there's different, the fire frequency differences might be related to the different type of fire severity causing either just kind of gap disturbances in a forest or completely stand replacement.
Okay, thank you. Andy or Bill, if you have other comments or questions to add on, feel free to type them into the chat box. Other folks, if you have questions that you'd like to ask our presenters, please feel free to type them into the chat box. And we'll give folks just a minute to do that.
Okay, can I comment on one more thing here?
Sure.
And according to Andy's question, one thing we have to think about, I spent 30 years doing fire histories, for instance. The first one was a fire history of a cedar glade, and then oak, savanna, etc. But the driver of vegetation is climate. It's not the other right way around. And whether it's the process of fire affecting the vegetation or whether it's other climate situations affecting the reproduction of a plant or whatever. But it's always fire that's driving both of those systems, vegetation and fire. Okay.
All right, thanks. I have one question for you. How do you see fire return intervals changing with the changing climate and changing species composition in the future?
Well, some places in the, this is kind of, I'll go to that model again, or that map. Some places we're expecting that the Southwest, which is now burning quite a lot, is going to actually burn less than it does now. That's because if they don't have precipitation, fuel reduction is occurring every year without precipitation. And this means that if you don't have enough fuel, you're not going to get frequent fires. And that's why the Northeast is kind of interesting, because the Northeast has plenty of fuel. In fact, what it needs is a little heat. I mean, if we want to see the fire process active, which we may not, I'm not pushing one way or another here, but certainly when you bring up the thermodynamics of heat into an environment, it is greatly going to increase many of the factors that affect the fire process.
Great, thank you. Well,
okay.
We're getting close to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. All right. I was just going to note we're getting close to 1 o'clock. If there are any final questions that our participants have, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Otherwise, I think we'll get ready to wrap up. But thank you very much to Richard and to Dan for chiming in and for this great presentation. We will make this webinar has been recorded, and we are going to make it available when we have our North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange website. It'll definitely be posted. In the meantime, it'll be housed on the Forest Skills website, and including the publications that Dr. Guyette posted on the last page of this presentation. So thanks again. Thank you very much to Dr. Guyette.
All right.
And thanks to everybody for participating today.
Yeah, thanks all, and bye, Amanda.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Bye.